criticism, I am extremely grateful that God calls people to do textual criticism, and equally grateful that I'm not one of them. So, you know, any kind of translation task will bring you into contact with textual variants for the first time and needing to try and make some sense of that. So it helps to have a little bit of background. If it's an area of interest that grabs you, you'll need to look for mentors other than me, because it's definitely not an area that grabs me. But it is hugely important. So essentially, textual criticism is the branch of study that seeks to understand or recover the original wording of an ancient text in our case. So the objective of textual criticism is to understand, what did Mark write, what did John originally write. And the reason that's important is because in the process of copying manuscripts by hand for a long time, errors crept in. And so often we will have manuscripts that have divergent wording. There are thousands of manuscripts and thus thousands and thousands of textual variants in the New Testament, most of them completely insignificant. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, there's very little meaningful doubt as to which word was original. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories that have done the rounds surrounding the textual debate. So modern textual criticism has its roots in two chaps by the name of Westcott and Hort. In the late 1800s, they published a thing called the Westcott-Hort New Testament. Predates them really, but they kind of took the center of controversy. They had some new theories around it, and I mean, they've been accused of every kind of evil under the sun, being occultists, etc., trying to steal the glory of God and so forth. But generally speaking, it's a sincere attempt of scholars to try and understand what was likely the original text. Of course, as Christians, this is very important to us because we believe that the original text was inspired and inerrant, but the copies and translations that were made from the original text, not necessarily so. So errors in that can definitely creep in, but we would hold that the original, the first version produced by the biblical author, is inspired and inerrant. So to know what the original wording was is significant for our theology. All right, very briefly, without trying to get into any of the detail. The dominant idea with textual criticism is that the variant which best explains the presence of the others is likely original. So it's a game of logic. Which variant is most understandable and how might it have evolved from the others is basically the key question. The variant which best explains the presence of the others is most likely original. And that has given rise to a few, quite a few sort of key principles. Most scholars will believe that the more difficult reading is likely original. Why? Because a scribe confronted by a difficult text or a statement that's theologically uncomfortable is more likely to simplify the text than he is to make it more complicated. So scribes will tend, if in doubt, to remove confusion, complexity, etc. So one of the key canons of textual criticism is that the more difficult reading is likely original, and likely, the simpler reading, represents a scribal intervention. Another one is that the shorter reading is frequently original. And the assumption here is that the scribes who copied, remember, many of them were monks working in monasteries. They were people who had a very high regard for the text. They would be more likely to add a word than they would be to delete a word. And sometimes this is pretty pragmatic because the manuscripts from which they copied were functioning manuscripts. In other words, they were versions of the Bible that were in active service in the worship community. So people may have made little notes in the margins and on the sides and that kind of thing. And sometimes a scribe would have been confronted with, is this something that a previous copyist accidentally omitted? So the scribal tendency is generally, if in doubt, put it in. So frequently the shorter reading is preferred by scholars. And if you dig into this, you'll find that there are various other ways of understanding scribal tendencies. Copying errors can come from their eyes jumping a line, or duplicating a word, or harmonizing, say, a text in a synoptic gospel to a parallel with which they are very familiar. So just understanding scribal tendencies often helps to understand what likely happened with a textual variant. In terms of manuscripts, we've got a lot of them now. If we go back to the time that the King James Version was translated, all that was available was 8 fairly late manuscripts, none of them earlier than 1000 AD. So the available Greek manuscripts were limited to a small number of late manuscripts, all from one manuscript family. That was the best available Greek New Testament at the time the King James was translated into English. But since then, literally thousands of manuscripts have been discovered. Many of them are parts of the New Testament. Not too many are complete versions. And with the discovery of far more manuscripts, of course, we've been able to get closer to the original text. We've got earlier manuscripts, we've got better quality manuscripts to work from, and so the text on which the King James Bible was based, the so-called Textus Receptus, or received text, is clearly not the best text. I mean, clearly, by any yardstick that you take, the text on which the King James was based is inferior. And the New King James, incidentally, works from exactly the same textual base as the original King James. So the New King James 1982 did not change its textual basis to a more modern text. A few more comments and then I'll stop on this. I won't take too many questions because I don't know too much about it, to be honest. My knowledge is fairly limited here. On texts, manuscripts, scholars tend to divide them into families and generally work with 3 manuscript families. They'll talk about an Alexandrian text, a Byzantine text, and a Western text. And they tend to group manuscripts into one of these 3 primary families. The argument is that groups of manuscripts have similar characteristics and quite probably trace from the same regions. The Alexandrian manuscripts tend to be the earliest, but we have few of them. And there are 2 in particular that the editors of NA28, the whole Nestle-Aland group, and the UBS text, there are 2 manuscripts in particular that they really like, and often will favor those 2 manuscripts over all others when there are points of dispute. So you'll see the manuscript represented by Aleph and the one represented by the capital letter B. Okay, so just hold on. That's house alarm going off. Sorry about that. Um, yeah, so the editors of some of the major modern texts strongly favor the Alexandrian text and tend to give it priority, even though it's represented by a small number of fairly early manuscripts. The other major manuscript family is the Byzantine manuscript family. This is closer to the King James tradition, and it represents the largest pool of manuscripts, but they are all a little bit later than the earliest ones in the Alexandrian tradition. So these are generally characterized by longer readings, and there is a school of textual criticism that argues that we should primarily follow a Byzantine-style text. It's known as the majority text view, and the best-known publication in that space is the Pierpont Robinson or Robinson Pierpont New Testament. This is closer to the text underlying the King James Version, the Textus Receptus. It's about halfway, in my opinion, between what you have as the eclectic text, which is the one largely based on Alexandrian manuscripts, and what we had in the original King James. So a majority text view is the view that says instead of primarily favoring a couple of early Alexandrian manuscripts, we should pay serious attention to the reading contained in the majority of texts, the majority of manuscripts, and that produces a slightly different text to what you get if you follow the sort of prevailing wisdom, which tends to be eclectic Alexandrian in orientation. So most of our modern translations of the New Testament are based on Kurt Aland, Bruce Metzger. These are the sort of main figures that have played a role in shaping Nestle-Aland 2728 and the UBS 345 tradition. And most of the Bible translations, NIV, ESV, those kinds of things, they pretty much use those texts. They might deviate here and there, but generally they use them. The Net Bible is a great resource for understanding textual variants. Net Bible certainly believes in the modern eclectic text, but it will often provide helpful footnotes that explain and give some sense of the reason for choices that have been made in the text. Okay. I'm happy to receive questions, but not sure I will know the answer if you dig deep.
What you shared with us now sounds like mostly sort of the literary aspect of textual criticism. You said the more difficult reading, the shorter reading, and that kind of thing. Once you've eliminated errors, but doesn't the historic aspect precede it? That you first look at the age of the text and with the assumption that the older texts would be more accurate or closer to the truth.
Yeah, the field will generally refer to external evidence and internal evidence. Scribal tendencies all relate to internal evidence, what happened in the copying process, etc. External evidence concerns things like how reliable is the manuscript in which a variant is found. If it's known to be a very reliable manuscript or believed to be a very reliable manuscript, then we take its reading more seriously than a manuscript that's known to be free and loose, etc. Everything's contestable, of course. So external evidence is how strong is the manuscript evidence. For instance, if a reading is found in all three manuscript traditions, so if you have it attested in the Byzantine, the Western, and the Alexandrian clusters, that's a strong indication that it may have been original, because it might point to an original ancestor manuscript that was the basis for all three of those, and then if you've got a variant reading that's emerged only in one of those manuscript traditions, it's likely that was a localized deviation. Yeah, so there are external and internal criteria that are employed, and different scholars will value these differently. So, some, and the eclectic tradition, which is your Nessel-Aland thing, tends, it has two dominant tendencies. It tends, when it comes to external evidence, to strongly favor the Alexandrian text, and it also tends to prioritize internal over external considerations, whereas the majority text goes the other way. It favors the Byzantine text, and it tends to favor preponderance of manuscripts as opposed to trying to interpret scribal tendencies.
And
Yeah.
and the guys who favor the Alexandrian text, is it because the Alexandrian text is older, and also because it's considered to be more accurate? I have heard that if you evaluate the text, that the scribes of the Alexandrian text seem to just have been more accurate in their copying and added less scribal insertions and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason for giving such high regard to the two main manuscripts, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, is that they are early, relatively early. By early we mean 4th century, sort of middle 4th century. And they are shorter manuscripts. So, there's a strong tendency to favor the shorter reading, and it's most pronounced in those who give credence to Alexandrian text tradition. One of the reasons for that is the Alexandrian text tends to be the shortest. And a lot of this makes good common sense, although it's been the basis of all kinds of conspiracy theorizing. It makes pretty good sense to believe that a scribe who loved Jesus is not going to leave the word Lord out. Lord Jesus Christ versus Jesus Christ. He's not going to leave out Lord, because it's an attestation to the status of Christ. He's not going to leave out Christ when referring to Jesus Christ intentionally. He's more likely to insert these kinds of terms than he is to omit them. So that kind of thing makes really good sense. If we take variants like, if you think of the one about Jesus in Mark 9:30-ish, talking about why his disciples couldn't cast out a particular demon, says this kind does not go out except by prayer, and some of the Byzantine tradition says does not go out except by prayer and fasting. Well, if we take seriously that the people doing the copying are monks, they're not going to leave out fasting. But it's pretty easy to understand how they could have inserted it. Maybe somebody wrote a little note in their manuscript, say, where it's next to prayer, they would say, and fasting, because that's kind of their praxis, and strong belief. And then the next copier thinks, well, was this written here because it was in the original and they made a copying error? Ooh, just in case, let's put it in. So the shorter manuscript, the earlier manuscript, the credibility of the Alexandrian manuscripts generally has persuaded, I would say, the overwhelming majority of specialists in this field that these are the most reliable external witnesses to the New Testament text, and that we need really good reason to favor some other, to favor another text over and against them. So it's not conspiracy based. I think it's an honest, sensible position. that these texts have received the favor that they enjoy at the moment. But it doesn't mean they're always right. It just means they're a good place to start. Okay.
Would you agree with the view of the guys from the eclectic text that internal evidence is weighs more than external evidence?
I'm not really in a position to comment. I don't really attempt meaningful engagement in this space. Doesn't scratch anywhere that I itch, to be honest. So, that's clearly their position. It is somewhat contested. I think the eclectic thing, though, is trying to weigh every single variant and consider, the relative influence of external and internal factors, and that's a pretty sensible approach, if you ask me. Whereas the majority text approach is largely about counting manuscripts. So they tend to take the reading contained in the majority of manuscripts. And I don't think that's as sensible a position, because it stands to reason that there could be one very early manuscript that made a mistake and was copied 1,000 times. So we have 1,000 witnesses to the error. Which all point back to one ancestor. So counting manuscripts as opposed to trying to explain each variant on its own merits, I would favor the latter. Seems to make sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't want to dig too much deeper than that. If it's a topic that interests you, a great place to start. There are some very advanced books on it, but a really good place to start if you want to buy and read something on this that's accessible to everybody. It's a readable introduction. It's by David Alan Black. I forget the title of it. Probably called Textual Criticism, with some kind of a comment on it. But David Alan Black, he wrote a little booklet of, I don't know, 120, 150 pages, probably very readable. Concise, but in enough detail to make sense of what's going on, and I think is the best and most useful starter resource on what is a very technical field if you dig deeply into it. Okay, let's leave that there and turn to John 1. I am going to invite questions on John 1.
Good morning, Kevin. Good morning, everyone.
Morning, Estelle.
A point that you made about the scribal tendency to simplify the text. The scholars that I read on our discussion on John 1:18, actually, after extensively looking at the internal and the external evidence of whether it should be monogenes theos or euos, he says that he believes that the offense of using theos probably drove a scribe to the less offensive Christology, of euos. And that was when you said that. I just realized that, okay, well, and also I've got a question for you. I want to ask you, if the original is monogenes theos, because that is what Wright seems to think after his extensive research. If it is monogenes theos, what would you say, Kevin? Is there any basis to translate it then as son, or should it be God? Is it maybe referring to his divinity?
To my knowledge, there's a high level of consensus amongst the experts that monogenes theos is original, primarily on the basis that it is the more difficult reading by far. And we are so used to monogenes theos that it's easy to imagine a scribe who's familiar with similar reference to monogenes theos in John 3:16 most notably, but there are a few other in John's writings, almost out of memory would write monogenes hios. So it's very likely, I think, that monogenes theos is original. If that's the case, I don't think there's any possible way you can translate theos as son. To do so, I mean, it doesn't mean son. There's no evidence of theos ever meaning son. So we have to translate it with theos being God, some kind of reference to God, which would make this one of, they dispute it, but one of approximately 9 or 10 New Testament texts that use theos with reference to Christ, because Christ is clearly the person being spoken of. I think it's Metzger, by the way, that points out that the very earliest papyri that we have a few papyrus fragments from John's Gospel. Some of them may be as close as 30 years after John originally wrote, and some of the very early papyri also have theos. So yeah, that's quite a strong indication that the reading theos was around within a few years of the publication, if you wish, of John's Gospel, production of John's Gospel. Yeah, so then we're into what to make theologically of monogenes theos as a Christological title. And I think, I mean, any text that refers to Jesus as theos must speak volumes about a high view of Christ that was present very early in the church. So critics of the Christian faith would like to believe that gradually over time, followers of Christ deified him and exalted him above what he would have claimed for himself or necessarily been believed upon by the early Jewish followers. But if John wrote even in the first century that Jesus was monogenes theos, and of course John 1:1 is a second reference of similar nature in the same text. This points to a high view of Christ, points strongly to early Trinitarian thought, I would say. And yeah, I mean, I'm delighted to have monogenes theos as the reference to Christ in John 1:18. The only begotten Son is a significant title, but any passage that refers to Jesus as theos seems to make strong reference to his deity, and this is one of them.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think the fact that the prologue to John is a nice unit, and verse 1 starts with referring to the Word as being God, and verse 18 ends with the same sort of reference, sort of an inclusio, beginning and ending, also strengthens the probability that theos is the right reading.
I agree. If it's theos, then there's a clear inclusio. Inclusio is a device that is used quite frequently in the Bible, where you basically bracket something by having an opening and a closing reference that starts and ends a theme. I think the best known one is the last shall be first and the first shall be last, which brackets a pericope in one of the synoptics. So yeah, we have the prologue bracketed by references to Jesus as theos, which if you take it all the way back into first century Judaism is an unbelievable statement. It's a remarkable statement. Okay, other? What's vexing you in translating this passage, if anything?
Kieran, I have a question. In that that posting that I've made, where Del Tondo referred to the problem in translating monogenes as only begotten. Now, when I translated it myself without referring to any biblical text, I prefer to just go to lexicons, you know, so that I only see the meaning of the word. I find I learn more by figuring it out that way. And I also translated it not as only begotten. I thought, but that doesn't seem to be the direct translation. What is your opinion on that?
My opinion is relatively unimportant. More noble opinions would come from references like BDAG, which give us this, pertaining to being one, only one of its kind within a specific relationship, one and only or only, pertaining to be the only one of its kind or class, unique in a kind. And that's the end. So the best contemporary lexicon strongly asserts that this is one of a kind, unique, etc. Now, of course, the kind could be sons. So Jesus is unique as a son of God. He's the only son who is a son eternally, etc. So monogenes hios makes perfect sense. We might be sons and daughters of God, but we are not in the same sonship class that Christ stands in relation to God the Father. By the way, the reference to only begotten comes from Yah. So mono, from monos, meaning only, and you can see here, this indicates that the belief is that monogenes is from monos, only, and genos, meaning kind, or from which we get genus in biological classification. So genos is kind, etc. But the word genao means to beget, to give birth to. Genao. That would be gamma epsilon nu alpha omega. Well, let's go and show you. So genao means to beget. So what we've got going on here is the understanding of the word as meaning monogenes as meaning only begotten, originated by assuming it was from monos plus genao, only, and genao, to beget, to give birth to. So this likely is an etymological error. And if we go all the way back to the time of the King James Bible being translated, which is, probably where this originates, knowledge of Greek would have been much more limited. Even available ancient Greek manuscripts would have been much more limited. So somewhere along the line, somebody assumed that monogenes comes from monogenao, only plus begotten, whereas now the prevailing belief is that it comes from mono plus genos, only of a kind, hence meaning unique. And I think this is now pretty much established as the meaning of the adjective, that it does not mean only begotten, it means unique, one of a kind, only one in its category, something along those lines. Yeah, and then we've got to take translation from there. So only begotten as a translation is definitely misleading. The word does not mean only begotten, it means one of a kind. Which of course has some bearing on some major historical debates about Christ, because was he begotten? Some of that would seem to trace to this kind of text, monogenes hios, and of course John 3:16. We go to John 3:16. There we go. Ton monogene. So it's ton hion, ton monogene. Second attributive position. Okay, so I think the definition is clear. It doesn't mean begotten.
Okay, thanks.
Good. Other?
Even if with John 1:1 C, where Theos, Leonardo's Theos, Cowell's rule is based on a pre-verbal predicate nominative, but not all the translations has Theos pre-verbal. How does that influence the translations, if at all?
What do you mean by translations?
Cowell's rule, his explanation of Theos and the translation of Theos is based on a pre-verbal. So Theos should be before the verb.
Theos is before the verb. Are there manuscripts that have it after the verb? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they do. So how does that influence the whole translation, if at all?
Right, I'm not aware of manuscripts that have theos as after the verb. We're referring to this clause here, kai theos en hologos, literally, and God was the word, where the verb is a version of estin. The subject is hologos, and the subject is marked by having the article. So we know hologos is the subject, not the predicate, because it has the article. Wherever you have ein, and you have one nominative with the article and one nominative noun without the article, the one with the article should be understood as the subject, even though in this case it comes last in the clause. So this is not and God was the word, it is and the word was God. Remember, in English we're going to put the subject first in clause. The positioning of theos as a noun before the form of estin in its clause is believed to be very significant. And a chap by the name of Colwell formulated a famous rule about preverbal predicate nominatives like theos being something other than indefinite. So if John wanted to convey with no marked sense the idea represented in the New World Translation, the Jehovah's Witnesses rendition, the word was a God, he would almost certainly have had to put theos at the end and have said kai hologos ein theos. That would have been about the only way he could have achieved that. The dominant view here in my understanding is that the preverbal predicate nominative can be definite or it can be qualitative. In other words, ascribing a quality to its subject. And that seems to be the point here, that he's ascribing that hologos, the word, was in all respects as God was. In other words, he was divine. He was God, not meaning he's the same person, because we've got clear distinction of persons. En arche en logos, in the beginning was the word, kai hologos en proston theon, and the word was with God, the God, referring to the Father, right? Kai theos, and this is predicated not of ton theon, the Father here, it's clearly a reference about logos. Kai theos and God-like, God in all quality respects was the word. Estelle, I don't think there's much debate around this. It's pretty well established as far as I know, except for people like the Jehovah's Witnesses who have no leg to stand on and clearly have a bias that they're trying to justify. But apart from that, I think it's pretty well established that John is saying, that the word was God, not meaning the word was identical in person with ton theon, the Father, yeah. But rather the word was in all respects what God was. So he's fully God in terms of his nature.
Thanks.
I don't want to get into the as far as manuscript evidence is concerned. There isn't even a marker here of alternate versions, so I'm not aware of manuscripts that reverse the word order, and it would seem that if they exist, they must be deemed fairly irrelevant because they don't make it into Metzger or don't even warrant a footnote in most versions, most Greek texts.
Sorry, Kevin, the ESV translation places Hologos before pain and Theos last.
No. Let's not get confused here. Those are translations. They are not manuscripts. A translation is an interpretation. All right. So to say the word, if we go into a translation, we're going to have the word was with God and the word was God. That's 100% right. Remember, if we come to our Greek clause, we've got, what's the subject of our clause here? Answer. We have got two. Hologos is the subject, which in English means it goes here. The word is the subject, and theos is the predicate. Theos is what is being predicated upon hologos. So the word was theos, God. The word order of the translation is correct because in English the subject belongs first here. We don't have a rule that says the one that has the article should be the subject. Right? The one that comes first is the subject. And that which is predicated in English must follow the form of to be, in this case was. So the translation here is 100% faithful to what we read in the Greek. When you say there are manuscripts that have the word order the other way, that would be Greek manuscripts. And I'm not aware of any of those. Most translations will put it like this. But God is understood here as all the qualities of God. He was in quality fully divine. Some attempts to capture the qualitative nature of theos in translation would have rendered John 1:1 things like, and the word was divine, or and the word was, I think there's another one that slips my mind at the moment. Moffat translation, I think, was one of them. So we've got variations like that, but they are very problematic as well because, you know, people will say the hamburger I'm eating is divine. So to say something is divine in popular speak, it falls far short of saying that that thing has all the qualities of God, which is the meaning here. So I think our best translation is the word was God, and we must understand this as meaning the word was everything that God was and is.
Thanks, Kevin. I got, when I read Caldwell's, when I understood this translation, I just, that bugged me a little bit because I thought to myself, well, how does Caldwell's rule fit into this translation? But it makes perfect sense that he was talking about a manuscript, not a translation. Thanks.
Yeah, his is a rule of Greek grammar, and his rule of Greek grammar says that if we move I don't remember the rule verbatim, but it has to do with the fact that if the author puts a predicate nominative that does not have the article, which is exactly what theos is here, in front of estin, he conveys something other than it being indefinite. So this doesn't mean a God here. It's closer to the definite or qualitative end of the spectrum. If we had just said hologos ein ho theos, the word was the God, you would be equating the person of the Father and the Son as one entity. And it's not doing that either. It's simply making the statement that he was theos by nature. All the qualities of. Okay. Anything else? Let's move away from John 1 verse 1. Wallace, by the way, discusses this at some length. So there's a very long, detailed discussion of this passage and this particular occurrence in Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Okay, anything else giving you hassles in John 1? Anything you want to probe in the last 10 minutes of this morning? This word, by the way, should be one of the ones that causes some consideration. You might recognize it as katalambano, which we learnt as meaning I understand, but it has more than one definition, and all of them fit here. So we can end up with quite different understandings of John 1 verse 5 based on what we make of the verb katelaben. Does it mean to overcome, to grasp, to understand? All of them potentially can fit. So if we open up BDAG, we'll see how to make something one's own, to win or retain, to gain control, to catch up with or seize, to come upon someone, to catch, there'll be one here, to process information, hence to grasp or understand. That's the sense in which we learned it in our greetings, ukatalambano. So, kaitofos ente skotia phaine, the light shines in the darkness. Kai he skotia, and the darkness, auto it, the light, ukatelaben, has not what? The darkness has not grasped the light, the darkness has not seized the light, the darkness has not won over the light, prevailed, etc. You can see that quite a few of these definitions could fit, and the selection of which one fits meaningfully affects the way you understand the verse. So that's a fairly vibrant debate, and it anchors around how we understand katelaben. Anything else? Okay. Well, if there's nothing else, I think we can call it a morning.
Sorry, I just quickly have a question about verse 13, if I may.
Yeah.
Sorry, my mute was still on. It says who are those who believe in him who are children, not out of blood, nor out of the will of the flesh, nor out of the will of man, but out of God, or of God. I was just struggling a bit with the meaning of those three terms, those three negatives. Not out of blood, not out of the will of flesh, not out of the will of man. Can you maybe say a little bit about that? I mean, for instance, what's the difference between thelematos sarkos and thelematos andros? It seems to be very close together.
They look identical to me. They look like just heaping up terms without, it's like love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, with all your being. I think we can multiply terms. It's probably just saying the same thing. Henny, I don't think there's a difference. I mean, the will of the flesh and the will of the man are pretty much the same thing, because men are fleshly, right?
Yeah, some translate it the will of a husband or something like that.
Oh, this one. Yeah. Well, I guess it's pushing the idea of having been born. So I guess if you really want to stretch things, you could maybe say it's born physically out of the flesh. Maybe that's the feminine reference, and andros being the contribution of a husband. To me, this just reads poetically. It looks like that they were not born naturally in any sense. It didn't have anything to do with human origins. They were born of God. I would take them as just parallel poetic, heaping up terms for dramatic effect. But Yeah, one might want to consult a good commentary or two and see if people think there's more nuance to it than that.
The thing that makes me think that there is a slight difference is with the first one, ex Heimaton, you don't have thelematos, so it doesn't seem to be equivalent, because the other ones have thelematos, the will of, which makes it, in my opinion, different from the first one, and therefore, you know, if the first one's not equivalent, then the other two, I don't think can be entirely equivalent either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess synonyms are never entirely identical in the sense that they're overlapping. So soul and spirit potentially are separable, but are frequently lumped together with other terms to give a sense of wholeness. And the big picture and the significance of what's being said is not found in splitting hairs between the individual components, but rather in lumping them together and understanding the whole that they represent together. So I may be wrong. You maybe have to look at some smart commentators, but my intuition reading this is that uk ex Heimaton, ude ek thelematos sarkos, ude ek thelematos andros. My intuition would not be to split hairs here too much, but to take these elements in combination as saying that, you know, those who believe and receive authority to become the sons of God do so not in any natural sense, but having been born of God. Okay, well, I mean, I don't claim to be an expert, but that's my intuition.
Okay, thanks.
It looks like the makings of a forum post if you've got something more to offer.
Okay.
Kevin, just a question around that particular text. When you have, you know, something like that, where you have, you know, not the will of, and then but the Father, do we insert the will of the Father because, you know, by implication, it's not by the will of those other things, but by the will of the Father, or do we just say, but from the Father?
Or of God.
I mean, yeah, sorry, I'm the Father, of God, I mean. I don't know if I expressed myself.
Yeah, no, in other words, your question is, has the phrase ek thelematos theu been omitted here? So
Correct.
Is he saying not of the will of the flesh, not of the will of man, but of the will of God? Or is he just saying, but they are born of God? My instinct, Gary, is that we should take ek theu at face value. I don't think it's clear that anything has been elided. So it's not obvious that we are to supply thelematos, because the final clause makes perfect sense as it is, and supplying thelematos as if he intended to say al ek thelematos theu, but of the will of God, definitely changes the meaning. It's different being born of the will of God to being born of God. And yeah, so I would think supplying thelematos would need some clear contextual reason to do so, and I don't see that here. So my instinct would be to say we are born of God. Yes, of the will of God, but it goes beyond that. We are born of God. And so in that sense, God becomes our regenerator, our Father, if you wish.
Okay, great, thanks.
Ellipsis happens often in these parallel style clauses. So, you know, it's a good question. And in many cases, something that's in a preceding or contrasting clause would, the implication would be that it's inferred to belong in the next clause as well. But I think in those cases, it should always be clear that the second clause has been abbreviated for poetic effect or something. But when it makes perfect sense and would seem to be significant exactly as it's worded, we should assume the text is clear and says what it means. Okay, we're out of time, everybody, so we're going to call it a morning. Yeah, looking forward to continuing to engage on the forum. Thanks for your time this morning, and we'll chat again online in a few weeks' time. God bless.
Thank you, Kevin. Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Kevin. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone.